certificate with Cal marked on it, saying I'm a graduate of Berkeley. You start to feel that's a little unfair for all the cash that you've put down here and all the pain you've had to go through, all those damned assignments that had to be on Sunday afternoon. Surely you get something. Well, you get the privilege of being able to carry this degree around where others don't. So there's a way in which, and trademarks become a particularly interesting aspect of intellectual property, having been boring for a long time, because they start to look at these questions of certification, which we get at with authenticity. So there are some issues here where I think we have skin in the game, even if in some ways we'd rather not. Now, I don't want to say, in fact, I'm not going to say, that the academic side of intellectual property is superior to the rest of the world, but out there it's a really grubby game. In fact, it might be better to start the other way around. This splendid chap, Mr. Moore, citizen of Oregon, had trouble with had cancer of the spleen. And it was so severe he was actually treated at UCSF as a major center. And in fact, they treated him incredibly well. And they would fly him down for special appointments. And the sort of bills didn't seem to turn up when he expected them to, and his insurance wasn't starting to go crazy. And so Mr. Moore got a little suspicious about why this was happening. So he dug around and discovered that dear old UC had patented his spleen. Because where other people who were being given this treatment responded really violently and were ill with side effects, he in fact sailed through very well. So the university began to be interested in why that was happening, and discovered why, and thought that's a really cool idea to patent. And so Mr. Moore got a little unhappy about that, and took them all the way to the Supreme Court. Anyone want to guess who won? If you were on the Supreme Court, who would you have sided with? Yeah, okay, you're all Mr. Moore. Then you can tell that sadly the story is not going to end so happily. So in fact, our sacred institution, despite being scolded a little for working behind this poor man's back, if that's the right metaphor when you're stealing someone's spleen, were in fact awarded the rights and this patent, the patent of Bill et al., on the ground of human ingenuity. And that has clearly ramifications in lots of places. Not only, and in fact, I avoided last year, I got a terrible allergy and had to go to UCSF, and now the forms and clearances that you sign just to get through the front door basically gives away your entire body to them if they should decide to use it, and you have no recrimination, and if you don't sign those forms, you don't get to see the doctor. But of course, this rolls on into questions of whether we can patent natural things like seeds, etc., etc. So that question of what it is human ingenuity enough? Is somebody looking ingeniously at a part of my body or your body enough to give them rights into it? Well, it seems so as well. Another way in which we can't look too gloriously on our own part in this, except that it was recently defeated. I don't know if any of you saw the recent defeat of the Eolus patent. It was one that the UC had a large share in because it was based on work done here, and claiming more or less that any embedded link on the internet was owed intellectual property dues to UC Berkeley because we'd thought of embedded links before anybody else was. In this case, it was struck down. You can tell, in fact, that we're involved in it because the patent was named after the street the chap that lived on, which is just off Sacramento Street down the road there. So when you start to look at, in part, the rewards that come to intellectual property, places like our own sweet institution don't always look quite as high-minded as noble as perhaps we would like to think. I don't want to make you think badly of the university, of course. But, and in fact, there's a much better side, and something I hope that we'll get to when we come to the computer, is that open source, in many ways, has its protection after a long battle that the university fought against AT&T over Unix and BSD, and all these machines, all these Apple machines run on BSD, and they do it in part because Berkeley fought that noble fight there. But there are then, so what I want to say is that there are a lot of issues current today whose roots I now hope to show in the limited time left come back historically quite far. Another area, just because it's in the news at the moment, or relevant to what's going on at the moment. I didn't think that I would have a slide with Newt Gingrich on, but why not? Newt Gingrich is being called up by, in fact, there's been an injunction against him for stealing the music from the movie Rocky to use as he marched into his campaign events. Not long earlier, in fact, Tom Petty went after Michelle Bachmann for using American Girl at her rallies. Now, assuming that Gingrich and Bachmann had paid iTunes their 99 cents for the download, is that overreaching in the world of intellectual property to say you can't use my song? I mean, if you're walking along the street playing Tom Petty music, and Tom Petty walks by and says, I don't like you, so stop playing that music, is that reasonable? Or can you say, well, I paid my 99 cents, so screw you? Thoughts? Yes. Hands going up everywhere. All right, yeah. So, well, there are two questions. I mean, one is scale and one is individual and public. Because would it the same that the individual public thing then apply to your parties? That you can really only play it on with earbuds because once you're out, it's public? Or it's more the scale? I mean, they're good questions. I mean, I'm not saying I know the answer here. The other hands are up. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, those are interesting, important questions, and the reason that that's a tricky one to answer, but a good one, is, of course, there are large commercial broadcast interests on both sides, both those who make the film and those of Comedy Central who want to play the film, and so it isn't quite as clear as in this case as someone who's outside the business. But yeah, no, they do. For those purposes, often, and we'll get to this, as the property can be broken down into defining different uses. Well, you can have the right to do this with it, but not that with it. Yeah.
And also going back to what we talked about before, that, using that something around to imply that those artists
right, I think that's a terribly important point here. They weren't just playing to get everybody dancing, but kind of Michelle Bachmann is suggesting that Tom Petty has her back, and I think that's why he wanted out there swiftly. And in fact, going all the way back, at least to Ronald Reagan, and Petty, in fact, had about 3 fights like this, interestingly. Artists have said, you cannot use my music because by doing so, you're suggesting that I am endorsing you, and I don't wish to endorse you. And there are lots of fights around. These are just 2 from the current election scandal, but 4 years ago, there were many more. ABBA, for odd reasons, has fought politicians across Europe who seem to like ABBA music. I think it would chase the voters away, but clearly they don't. I don't know. There's a good question there. At what point can you stop and say this is just an ordinary use and not a political use, or what can you countervert? So, well, I'm not going to let you drive my kind of car because I don't like who you are. I think they're very important questions about this kind of control. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, that's clearly one. I mean, part of that, I think what Adam was saying is it's a political judgment. I don't like your politics, so I don't want you to use my stuff. But equally, there are many reasons in which the state has an interest in saying, well, hang on, because that will, if we let that go too far, then you can have no kind of political criticism at all. I can't show Newt Gingrich saying something absolutely idiotic, because he can say, well, you're stealing my copyright. So, there are, and again, these are not clear-cut issues. You can see they're important ones. This one, in fact, very much involves that notion of the author's right that I just mentioned in Parsons White Author. How much does an author have a right to say what is done with their work after it leaves their hands? And some people say, well, you have no rights at all. You recorded it, you made it public, now we can do what we like. Others say, well, no, let's be a little more circumscribed and say, no, there are certain things that you can't do, particularly try to imply that you have an endorsement. But probably great. Okay, so those are a lot of the questions. I just wanted to bring them to the surface because what I hope is you'll see them as we go now into some of the history, running through this stuff in odd ways, and people fighting with, as I think some of you did very nicely in the assignments, were saying, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, seems to be, in the end, you discover the one thing you don't want is actually ever to have to sit on the Supreme Court, because to have to make these decisions is very difficult. One of the first questions we have to ask then is actually, what is property? We can talk about property all we like, but is there a way, Jeremy Bentham says, look, when you listen to most people talking about property, they have no idea how to define it or what it is. And if we can't define regular property, then how can we begin to ask the question of, well, is information property? And does it look like the other kinds of property? Is this simply an analogy, or is it really exactly the same thing? And we'll again see people from all sorts of different sides. So we have notions about life, liberty, property, and not being deprived. Anybody want to offer a definition of what property is? Yeah. Very nice. And in fact, we were therefore just looking at examples in one way of exclusion. Absolutely right. It's the rules governing normally said the access to material goods. But clearly when we get into intellectual property, then it becomes rights over intellectual goods. But it is the right, and as some say, it's the right without having to enter into a contract. So it's just it's a right that's there without needing justification, that you cannot come onto my property, you cannot take my property. So that notion of exclusion is very important. So what kinds of property do we know of? Or rather, what kinds of ownership? Do we know? Anyone think you can enumerate different kinds? There are actually terms that you probably have met, though you may not quite realize they're defining. I mean, there's common property, property in common, which no one person can have a claim to, but everybody has a right to. And there are lots of arguments today about the commons. The digital commons is the internet commons, etc., etc. That has a very long history. A long history in which much land, usually around towns and villages, was owned by the collective, and everybody had a right to use it, and nobody could be excluded if they lived in the town. And in fact, it was a major move in Britain in the 17th and 18th century to remove that stuff from the commons and make it private, and cause many very aggressive battles. Property is needed for private property. There are two that are most usually and clearly marked, that they have to be rivalrous and excludable. Anyone define those terms for us? Yeah. Okay, so there's another term that comes with this then, which is called public good rather than property. There's private property and public good. So keep going. Yes. Okay. So non-rivalrous meaning. Well, yeah. I mean, you're on the right lines, but Angelica, can you give us a bit more? Right. I mean, there's one kind of excludable. The rivalrous, it means that only one person can use it. And if I have it, you can't have it. Now, an excludable means that I can also have a method to keep you off it. So that there's a significant way in which I can go. So rivalrous and excludable are normally thought as two terribly important parts of property, but they become problematic when we think of intellectual property. And then we mentioned before that there are sort of limitations on property. That's why when we thought about a song, we can say, well, maybe, or we mentioned a movie clip, I can say to you, well, you can have the use of this clip to do certain things with it, but you can't do other things with it. Now, in general, property is thought to be something that you hand over all rights entirely. But more and more, and again, particularly in the digital world, we're dividing that up and saying, well, no, I'm not going to give you just the complete rights over this thing, I'm just going to give you a few of the rights, and maybe not all. And that's something which also has a history. So as we think of those more or less as the aspects of property, then the question we have to ask is, can information, does it have these properties? And in particular, what's always asked is, well, is it a rivalrous good? And it doesn't seem to be. Or is it excludable? And it doesn't seem to be. So when we then start to think about it as a public good, but if it's a public good, can it be private property? And if you read those newspapers, you could see in a way, and if you look through those laws, people are constantly battling with these things and trying to work out what happens. One of the issues of property is the question of how we acquire it. From the Justinian Code, the great Roman code of property, occupation was originally said. So if you're in occupation, you more or less have rights. But that has changed. So by the 18th century, Blackstone, who wrote the great codification of English law, which of course is now Anglo-American law, outlined these ways. There were 7 ways. He said, well, it can come by descent. It can come by purchase. So we're okay with both of those. If you hand it down, you can purchase. A sheet is a slightly tricky one. A sheet is that if the ownership of the property, and it goes back to feudal times, so we don't have to go into it, but if the ownership of the property becomes void, then it goes back to the lord of the manor. So that isn't going to be a property with your iTunes file, I imagine. Occupancy, prescription is more or less when the king or the lord says, this is yours, no one else has it. Forfeiture is when you give up your property and someone else gets it, and alienation is more or less also when you lose the rights over it. Well, again, Blackstone was able to write those out fairly easily if you think about land, but again, at the very time that he was writing, people were saying, but is this the same for ideas? Because ideas seem to come with other principles. And as you argued about those two newspaper pieces, it seemed very clear that you had a lot of important, significant, justifiable, but very different ideas about them. Historically and in different cultures, the idea of owning ideas is almost repellent to some. Confucius, says, I simply transmit ideas. I don't create anything, and therefore I have no right to them. Islam, Sharia law, more or less will attack people for imposture and fraud, for plagiarism, but it doesn't give you a property right in that stuff. You can't steal these ideas. Maybe you can imitate them unfairly. And in fact, for a long time, Christianity, and I know we're now all very familiar with reading Latin from our earlier readings, scientia dona knowledge is a gift from God, and therefore it can't be sold. So these are very clear religious statements about ideas that influenced us, and in which in many ways, as ideas of property developed, people were kind of fighting against and moving against. One of the major statements against it, one of the theories that runs very much through this, is John Locke, who we met before. And he produces this argument that if we think about land, that will help us think about ideas. And though the earth be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This is nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. So first he owns his body. Well, we know that poor Mr. Moore discovered that wasn't the case now. But for John Locke, we owned his body. Then there's the labor from his body and the work of his hands. And we say whatever he does, his labor, The product of his labor is his, and he'll use his in those days, his or her now. And then he says, whatever he removes from the state that nature has provided and left it in, and he has mixed his labor with and joined it to something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. So the next step is if you find something that nobody else owns, and you work on it with your hands, it becomes your property. It being by him removed from the common state nature placed it in, it has by his labor something next to it that exclude the common right of other men. So by your labor, now he's talking primarily manual labor here, but we start to think about intellectual labor too, you are creating something to which you have an exclusive right. So there's one view of it, therefore, is that all property, and this includes intellectual labor, intellectual work, is a product of labor, and it's that labor theory of value that works with it. But if you look at someone like Daniel Defoe, he actually makes a different claim. He says that the author's property is the child of his inventions, the brat of his brain. So it's yours as much as your children are. You produce this property just as you produce children, and you have a right over both of them, which no one can take away. We've actually met this metaphor before. You may remember a while ago that talking to Lysias about the speech, and Socrates says, blame Lysias who is the father of the brat. This idea that these things are the children of your mind, but they're yours in the way your children are. Now, we may ask some questions about how a children property that will come to the surface here. But that claim that there's something very special about ideas. It doesn't look like other acts of labor. It has this particular relationship to it, and this very close relationship. This is an early Irish tradition, but running out of time, I won't go into that. So this runs through this battle. Well, there's one thing, therefore, is that the author has this inherent and natural right to his work that nobody can take away. The question then comes up, well, is that a limited right or is that an eternal right? I mean, if I own a piece of property, it's mine to hand down to my descendants, and my descendants to pass down, and nobody can infringe on that right unless I sell it. So why should we have a limited time? If the justification is that it looks like property, then why should we have a different view of intellectual property? And in fact, this is a marvelous occasion when who would become probably the two most famous authors of their time, Rudyard Kipling, the English author, who I'm sure some of you have heard of, and Twain, I assume all of you have heard of him. Kipling is a young author, and he really wants to meet Mark Twain. And he goes to New York and tries to find where he is, and Twain is actually up in New England, and he has this long and arduous journey, and he finds him, he knocks on the door, and they sort of have this great encounter, and they sit down and say, let's talk. And Kipling then writes a newspaper article about it. I mean, this is great. Here are the two finest minds of the literary world in their time. Let's read what they talk about. And they can't talk about anything but copyright law. And the two of them sit there the whole time and say, we're being ripped off. You know, this is lousy. The world's terrible. There they are. Kipling is making his way. Twain by that time is very rich. Absolutely furious. And so Twain says there's a great deal of nonsense talk about international copyright. The proper way to treat copyright is to make it exactly like real estate in every way. There should be no difference between landed property and intellectual property. The two are exactly the same. And here are the two. And in fact, one thing that both of these people tried was actually to trademark their names. An advantage of trademark over other forms of intellectual property is, what's one distinction that trademark has? In fact, if you look more and more, people are trying to shift patents and copyrights into trademark law. Why would they want to do that? Yeah. It's like landed property, it's in principle eternal. So in many ways, it's much better to have a trademark protection. You have to renew it, but as long as you renew it. And so both of them tried this, but they're both saying, look, there's no difference between our property and any other kind of property. On the other side, and we'll see this in different places, but you get people like Michael Polanyi, who some of you may have heard of, great scientist, who makes the other argument in a way that what's really important ideas, and some of you said this, is that they circulate. Now the question is, he's saying that knowledge is only reaped, that the value of knowledge is reaped when it's free. So now, who has the most principled argument between those groups, between Twain and Kipling on the other side and saying, look, it's like real estate, and Polanyi who's saying, no, this stuff should be free? Who's arguing from principle there? Yeah? Uh-huh. So in part it's a perspectival thing, and it's his perspective in some way. So of course he in some ways wants this to extend to all intellectual property in the end, but yeah? Polanyi, yeah. Mm-hmm. So in some ways Polanyi can almost be accused of, as he was, of giving away other people's property. And then say, well, yeah, but if you want to do that, you're claiming expedience. You're saying, look, I don't care whether it's property or not, it's better if it circulates freely. Now, in fact, that's sort of what we read in the Constitution from a different point of view. It says we're going to write this into the Constitution because it's good for the circulation of ideas, for writing and invention. So the question is, are we just doing this because economically it's a good fix? And some of you in the assignment said, look, this is just an economic question. Which is economically more important? Whereas others can say, no, look, it's quite different. It's a matter of principle. It really is a matter of this stuff belongs to those people and we have no right to take it away, whether it's economically beneficial or not. And although in some ways I think some of us might like to side with Polanyi, oddly enough, these two grasping writers who want as much money as they can from their work can claim in some ways to be arguing from principle if we think of ideas as property in the same way that we think of other pieces of property. Because that's what Twain says. If it's just like real estate, then we should treat it like real estate. Yeah. Right, which is perfectly, and in a way that's part of what the Constitution is doing. It's saying, we're giving it because it's expedient, and we can justify that expedience in good ways and saying that these works are terribly important and we like them, but we have to remove that away from principle. Now, I sort of bring that up in some way because if you look at the European tradition, there's a very strong line which looks quite different. In that if you look at Diderot, who we met already before, talking about the encyclopedia, he is absolutely appalled by the idea that we just say that this is like a piece of land or like Locke, that's something we've worked on. He said, what form of wealth could belong to a man if not a work of the mind, if not his own thoughts? That everything else is just insignificant in comparison. What comparison could be between the very substance of a man, his soul, and a field, a tree, a vine, that an individual has only appropriated through cultivating?